Dr. Carolina's research interests include immigration, law and society, the sociology of education, race and ethnicity, youth and families, and the US-Mexico borderlands. Her work explores how various forms of legal and social exclusion impact the lives of immigrant youth and their families, including their educational trajectories, mental health, and political participation. Her current book manuscript explores the intensification and expansion of immigration enforcement and its consequences on undocumented immigrants and their families. And in another project of Dr. Carolina's work, she spent analyzing the experiences of immigrant families who reunite in the US post-deportation. And since 2017, Dr. Carolina has been co-directing the Undocu Research Project. This project examines the experiences of immigrant high school students and school personnel who work with them. So today, we are honored here at CL to have Dr. Carolina. She'll be talking about how to navigate the admissions process as an undocumented student. And so without further ado, I'm going to stop share and I'm going to allow Dr. Carolina to take over. So please welcome Dr. Carolina. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Denisha, for the introduction, and also thank you and fellow organizers for bringing us together today. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. If okay, everyone can see that okay? Yes, you can see it. Okay, perfect. So to begin, I did want to share just a little bit of my own background, given the topic of today's webinar. And so I am somebody who grew up undocumented. I received my bachelor's degree in sociology and also a bachelor's degree in criminology and justice studies from COSE San Marcos. And then it was towards the end of the third year in college and with the help of a mentor of mine that I first learned about grad school. And so at the time, I didn't really have anyone in my immediate group of family and friends that had gone to grad school, let alone applied while undocumented. And so I had many questions at that stage, especially around funding and disclosing my immigration status, etc. And so back then, little by little, I began connecting with undocumented students who were pursuing graduate school in other parts of California. And they were providing me with invaluable advice and feedback on my statements. They were also sharing important resources with me. And so with a lot of help and their support, I ended up applying to grad school and went straight into a master's program after I graduated from COSE San Marcos. Once I got my master's, I took a bit of a gap year, and then I went on to Harvard to complete my PhD, and then UCLA to do a one-year postdoc through the UC President's Postdoc Fellowship Program. And then now I'm going into my fourth year at UCI as a faculty member in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society. And over time, I should also note that my status has changed from undocumented all the way until 2012, when I was able to benefit from deferred action for childhood arrivals. And so I had DACA from 2012 to 2016, and then became a legal permanent resident, and then a few years after became a U.S. citizen. And so this was all through my graduate studies that I was undergoing these transitions in legal status as well. So that's a bit about my trajectory, and I'll share a little bit more as we go on for today's webinar, but I'm very excited to be here with you all. I do have a lot of information and resources to share about how undocumented students can pursue the graduate school application process. I'm going to try my best to dedicate plenty of time for the Q&A, because I know oftentimes it's very helpful to connect with other folks and then also share your specific questions and concerns. So with that, let me go ahead and dive right in. And so first, you're going to start wondering, like, why apply to graduate school and what are some of the factors to keep in mind? And so I did want to begin by discussing the set of circumstances that may be shaping your decisions around grad school. So this might include personal considerations, professional or financial reasons. And so, for example, some of you may want to become doctors, lawyers, professors, or engineers. And so for these and many other careers, you often need a specific degree to be able to work in that field. And so one of the key steps to take as you start considering grad school is sort of to figure out what careers are you most interested in, most passionate about, and then also what kind of degrees are necessary to pursue those careers. And then also at the same time, I want to acknowledge that some folks may need to prioritize working right now to save money, and then subsequently you may need to postpone pursuing grad school. And so the factors and the timing of your decision will vary, and there's really no one way to approach grad school. But the main thing is to sort of figure out your own circumstances, talk to others, get advice and support, and then also figure out what makes the most sense for your own trajectory. The other thing is that, and this is an aspect that's often not talked about, but I do want to acknowledge, is that the experience of being undocumented itself is tied to a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And so for some students, staying in school can be a way to sustain hope or some level of certainty and protection. And so that's also a valid concern as you're sort of weighing different considerations for grad school. Again, as I mentioned earlier, personally, I knew that I wanted to pursue grad school during my last year as an undergrad. And so at the time, I had been involved in doing research and organizing. And so when I talked to one of my mentors about potential careers to pursue, I knew that I wanted to conduct research and work with students. And so it was my mentor who introduced me to the idea of becoming a professor one day. And then for that, I knew that I needed to get a PhD. And so back then, I applied to both master's and PhD programs. But at the same time, there were a lot of different factors that were weighing heavily in my decision. So for me, it included things like financial considerations, distance and travel, and also state level policies. Keep in mind that this was also back in 2011 and in California. And so as an undocumented student, we did have access back then to Assembly Bill 540, which provides eligible undocumented students with access to in-state tuition. But we did not have the California DREAM Act, which provides access to state financial aid for eligible undocumented youth. And we also didn't have DACA, which provides access to a temporary work permit for those who qualify for DACA. And so not only were the California DREAM Act and DACA not implemented back then, but they were also nowhere in the realm of possibilities back in 2011, in the sense that there was no way of knowing that those would be later introduced and implemented. And so I share this to illustrate a few things. One, as you start the grad school application process, it's really helpful to check in with trusted mentors and discuss with them your interests, your passions, and your career options. And then also, if as you're thinking through your own options, you realize that a PhD is your ultimate goal, then it's important to know two things. One, you often don't need a master's to go into a PhD program. Many programs accept students who are coming straight from undergrad, and so that's one thing to consider. And then two, if you know that a PhD is your ultimate goal, it might be worth considering applying to both master's and PhD programs at the same time. And then you sort of revisit your options once those letters start coming in terms of where you've been accepted and what the funding looks like, etc. And then also, there's really no right way to do this. And so for me, I share that I went straight from my undergrad into my master's program, and then I took 1 year off before I started the PhD. But I do want to acknowledge that many others have taken longer breaks or they've gone straight from undergrad to a PhD. And so it really depends on your own circumstances. And so I would encourage you not to feel pressure to follow a certain path. And ultimately, what's going to be best is to really reflect on your own interest, your own circumstances, to seek support along the way as you're considering different options, and then to decide what's the trajectory and timeline that makes the most sense for you in your own circumstances. Other things to keep in mind when thinking about grad school is that there's different routes to pursue, and each of these have different timelines, resources, etc. So for example, there's the master's program route, which typically can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years, sometimes 4. It really depends on the field, the school, the program. Funding does tend to be more limited at the institutional level for master's degrees. And there's also fewer fellowship opportunities that fund master's programs. So there's sort of a couple to know about. But so that's with master's programs. With PhD programs, you're typically looking at 5 or more years to complete a PhD, and funding can vary significantly. And we're going to return to this question on funding in a few slides, since I know that that's often a major concern for folks. There's also professional schools. If you're somebody who wants to get a professional degree, like a law or medical degree, for example. If you identify as someone who's undocumented, it's really important to note that license requirements and eligibility do vary by state. And so you are going to want to do quite a bit of research ahead of time if you're interested in pursuing a professional degree. And then other things to keep in mind as you're sort of figuring out, do I do a master's, a PhD, or go on to professional school? It's sort of to again come back to this question of what's the ultimate goal, what requirements are necessary for the career or the position that you're most interested in. And then the other thing that's really helpful is to connect with people who've gone through each of these routes that you're exploring, to really learn about their own journey and which ones make the most sense for them. And then you can sort of also take those into consideration for your own trajectory and your goals and interests. In terms of graduate school expenses and what to expect, there's the cost that's associated with applying. And so there's application fees. It could be anywhere from like $50 to $100 or maybe a little bit more per application. And so let's assume you're applying to like 10 different schools and they're around the $100 mark per application, then you're sort of looking at $1,000 for covering the cost of applying to those 10 programs, if we're assuming each charges around $100 for applying. Other expenses have to do with tuition and fees. And in those costs might be things like your health insurance, parking, transportation, etc. And then you'll want to also figure out whether, as an undocumented student, and depending on the state that you'll be pursuing grad school in, whether or not you would qualify as somebody who would be charged in-state versus out-of-state, and out-of-state being often like 2 or 3 times more than in-state tuition fees. And so that's also something to sort of figure out. And then also private versus public, those fees are going to vary significantly. There's also the cost associated with school supplies. Think about like books for courses that you might be taking, your computer, etc. There might also be research costs. And so if you are somebody who's doing a PhD, for example, and eventually for your dissertation, you want to interview folks, then you're going to start thinking through, okay, how much would it cost to cover incentives for folks that you interview, transcription cost. Sometimes, or a lot of the times, there's grants available that you can sort of apply for, either at the department, institutional level, or outside foundations. But I mentioned research because that's also a grad school related expense to think about. There's also conferences and professional development costs that may come up. So in sociology, for example, there's the American Sociological Association, which hosts a conference every year where you can present your work. You can also learn more about other people's works, and then also connect with those who have similar interests. But usually to attend the American Sociological Association, there's like a membership fee, there's also a conference fee, and then there's also travel expenses. And so these are all within the realm of like conferences / professional development costs. Grants also may be available to cover these kind of costs, but I included it in the list of like grad school expenses to keep in mind. And then of course there's also living and family expenses like your housing, your food, utilities, internet, childcare, etc. And again, we'll return to this issue of expenses and funding and resources that are available for folks. In terms of entrance exams, so depending on the school and the program that you are interested in pursuing, they may or may not require you to take an entrance exam, and to share the scores that you get with them as part of your grad school application process. Some of the entrance exams include the GRE, which is the Graduate Record Examinations test. And there are fee waivers available for these. So you'll just want to check their official websites, and they include information about who qualifies for a fee waiver to take the GRE, for example, or the LSAT. And to also allow yourself enough time to apply for the fee waiver and then to ultimately take the test and share those scores with the programs that you're interested in. A few things I'll note here is make sure to double check the ID requirements. And so just double check with the testing centers what kind of form of identification you'll need to take with you during the day of the exam. You may or may not need to obtain a passport from your country of birth to enter the test center. And I know that that was something that was coming up for a lot of undocumented folks, that you sort of needed to know ahead of time that you needed to take a passport with you. But again, for the most updated information and guidelines around what forms of ID you need to take, I would recommend checking like the official websites for the GRE, the LSAT, or the MCAT, depending on which one you need to take. Also, you want to make sure you check with the school requirements, because some schools, or I should say some programs, are making the exams optional. And so it's really important to check, like, this is the specific program I'm interested in applying to. This is what they require from me. It might be like a personal statement, a research statement, copies of my transcripts from college, and then also check whether or not they want you to take one of these tests. Again, some of them are making it optional, and so you'll just want to make sure that if they do require it, you have enough time to take it. A few factors to consider when you're identifying programs is definitely location. Also keeping in mind that the city and state context can vary quite significantly when it comes to immigration policy. And so as I shared the map a few slides ago, there's different policies depending on the state where you'll be living and pursuing grad school in, that have to do with whether or not you would benefit from in-state tuition or state financial aid, etc. And then there's also different professional licensing policies in place that you'll also want to become aware of. And then there's also travel safety concerns. For example, if you identify as someone who's undocumented without DACA, one of your concerns might be, do I have to go through a federal immigration checkpoint to go to grad school? Do I have to take an airplane to move to and relocate to a different state? These are some of the location related concerns that you might want to think about. And then also, of course, proximity to your own support network, and figuring out how that factors into the equation as you're figuring out which programs to apply to, and whether that means you end up applying to those that are close by, or whether you're able to think of options outside of the area where you live. Other factors to consider include things like program requirements. As you're looking at different programs to apply to, you'll just want to keep an eye out for, let's say, like, what are the course requirements that they have? What are the exam requirements? What does teaching and research experience look like for that particular program? One thing to know is that certain work requirements may require you, or may necessitate that you have a work permit. And so you just kind of have to investigate with the particular programs that you're applying to, what those guidelines are around securing teaching assistantships or research assistantships, for example, and whether or not some of these assistantships are paid or unpaid, etc. Other factors to keep in mind are things like timing. And so I know right now too, there's the timing that has to do with like with your own personal trajectory of figuring out whether you'll want to go from undergrad to master's to PhD or straight from undergrad to PhD, etc. But then there's also the timing to navigate in the in light of the uncertainty that's going on right now with respect to DACA, but then also elections quickly approaching. And so that's also something to consider and talk with your mentors about, this issue of timing. There's also, of course, financial responsibilities, whether or not you would be taking a gap year or multiple years, and then also the type of work or research experience that you have or would want to have before applying. And then other things, of course, include things like undocu-friendly, like how undocu-friendly are the programs that you're thinking of applying to. And this could be determined in several ways. It could be, are there folks in the program who are sort of the mentors or folks who are openly advocating and or not even openly, but like who are serving as the mentors for undocumented students within that particular program. Are there undocumented student services resource centers at some of the schools that you're thinking of applying to? Are there staff and programming events as well for undocumented students? Like these are all things that can help you get a sense of how undocu-friendly a program and or the school are. And then let me think through if there's, so these are all sort of the various factors to keep in mind. In terms of application components, again, this is going to vary by program and department, but generally you're looking at needing to submit an online application, a personal statement, a research statement, your CV or your resume, where you sort of list out your previous work or research experience or volunteer experience as well, and then letters of recommendation. And so these are generally the components, but again, you'll want to make sure that you double check with the particular program you're interested in applying to make sure that you have all of the different guidelines and requirements outlined ahead of time so that you're able to meet those requirements. And then I included this slide because some programs may ask you to interview as part of the application process. And so usually like you would submit your application and then the department will decide among X amount of applicants, they want to interview, I don't know, I'm just going to make up a number, but let's say they want to interview 10 or 20 students. If you do have to do an interview with faculty members, some of the questions they might ask you include things like if you can tell them a little bit more about your research interest, what motivates you to apply to that program in specific, or sometimes there's also an opportunity for you to ask if you have any questions about the program. And so these are just a few to keep in mind if you end up applying somewhere in where they require an interview as part of the selection process. And then funding. So again, as I mentioned, application fees vary. It could be $50 per program to apply to it, or $100 or a little bit more. There might be fee waivers available, but this again really depends on the program. For this, I do want to recommend also this particular guide that was put together by the by NSOC. And let me share the link here in the chat feature. If I can get to it here. Okay. So I shared the link now in the chat feature, but it will take you to a guide that the folks from the the New York State Youth Leadership Council organization compiled. And so in the guide, they do provide a really helpful template for how to inquire about whether or not a program offers a fee waiver for undocumented students. And so that's why I mentioned the guide, because you could use that template as you are sort of reaching out to programs to figure out whether or not they have fee waivers available, because this could help save costs during the application stage. And then there's also, again, fee waivers that may be available for some of the tests, like the LSAT, the GRE, and the MCAT. And so for that, you'll want to make sure that you check the official testing centers, like their own websites. There might also be scholarships available to help you cover the cost of application fees. So one of them in particular, it's the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers. It's IRT for short. And their program, if you apply and you're selected for it, they typically offer fee waivers for folks for 10 to 12 graduate programs. And so that's also a really helpful resource to know about. The application for that program typically opens in the fall and is due in the spring. And so you'll just want to make sure to, one, look into it, but then also allow yourself plenty of time to apply for it. I'll also share that one on the chat feature here. I'll share the link for that one. And then there's also, of course, fundraising efforts that you might consider doing to help you cover the cost associated with the application stage. When it comes to tuition and fees, so typically what may happen is that, let's say you are accepted into a program, then they would send you a financial package letter of sorts. And so there is where they will let you know, like, this is how much tuition and fees will cost for the years that you're enrolled in the program. This is how much the program may be offering you towards funding. And also when they let you know, like, okay, this is how much we can provide you with for a stipend, let's say. That might include a combination of like a research and a teaching assistantship, for example. And so it's really important to meet with your mentors to discuss those financial packages, those offers when you get to that stage. So you can sort of figure out like, okay, this is how much it costs, this is how much they're offering, and you can compare and contrast some of these letters and figure out one that best meets your needs. And also figure out whether or not you need to then loop back with the program and ask if there's any other forms of financial assistance available. Maybe there might be some institutional level fellowships that you could be considered for. But again, it's really key here to connect with mentors, trusted mentors, to help you navigate that process. Similarly, for research and professional development related expenses, there might be grants available to help you think through the costs for traveling to conferences, or incentives for conducting interviews as part of your own dissertation research, etc. These ones are tend to be sort of more specific to the discipline and field that you're pursuing. And so in the social sciences, just to give you one quick example, there's the Russell Sage Foundation that offers grants for students who are at the dissertation stage, and again, who are in the social sciences. And so that would be one foundation to think through. But there's sort of plenty or more foundations to potentially look into when it comes to covering the research and professional development related expenses. Other things to keep in mind are things like institutional aid, and then private aid like scholarships, fellowships. I do have a few in this next slide. These are some of the key funding opportunities that are open to undocumented students. And so I would encourage folks to look into them further. The Davis and Putter Scholarship, the second bullet point here, last I checked at least, for that one, it can be used either towards a master's or a PhD program. And so that one's just really helpful to know of because, again, there's not that many scholarship or fellowship opportunities, especially for the master's level. And so that's one to think through if you're considering a master's program. And so this is like sort of like some of them to think through. Also, the other thing I want to mention, Immigrants Rising does have their own database as well, where they keep track of funding opportunities that are open to undocumented students. And you could actually filter out by whether you are looking for scholarship opportunities at the undergrad level or at the grad level. And so I would also highly encourage folks to check out their database, and then you can filter out again by undergrad versus grad. And I think they might also let you filter out by field. And so it's just a really helpful resource as well to keep in mind. And I'll come back to some of these resources too at the end of the slides here. But the other thing I wanted to take a moment to share is that the bulk of the info and resources that I've shared with you today are tailored to the experiences of undocumented students, given the topic of the webinar for today. But I did want to take just a brief moment to share some resources and additional set of considerations for anyone who might identify as an international student, since I realize that there may or may not be international students in the audience. And so in terms of considerations, it's also very important to check in with the specific programs that you're considering, um, to sort of keep in mind the different requirements and the deadlines for meeting those. One of the common requirements, for example, for grad school would include a copy of your undergrad transcripts. And so if the transcript is in a language other than English, then you may likely need to have it translated. And so you just want to give yourself enough time to allow for that. And so, for example, at NYU, this is their requirement when it comes to transcripts. And I sort of included it here on the slide. And the link where you can find out more information about that. But again, the key is to make sure that you keep in mind the specific requirements by program, and then also give yourself enough time to meet those. The other thing to do is to check if the school that you're considering has an international student center, because those type of centers provide helpful information and resources and services as well. So for example, at the University of Texas, Austin, they have an office for international students that provides information about visas, taxes, insurance, and more. And then in terms of other resources, NYU has a very comprehensive guide of the different considerations to keep in mind as an international applicant, including things around visas and work after graduation. And so I included the link here as well to check out. And then Princeton Review also has a set of considerations to keep in mind, such as information about the test of English as a foreign language, which some students may be required to take as part of their grad school application if English is not their native language or if they didn't complete their college education in the US. And so also highly recommend checking it out. And then I also want to highlight UCSD for a quick second here, because they developed a very helpful list of frequently asked questions, both from the perspective of international students, which is the screenshot you're seeing here, and then also from the perspective of undocumented students, which is the second screenshot that I included here. And so for both undocumented and international students, I really can't emphasize this enough, but I would recommend reaching out for support to trusted mentors as you navigate the grad school application process, because inevitably there's going to be specific questions and concerns that come up. The process itself can also be very stressful and overwhelming. And so I just issue this as a helpful and friendly reminder that you don't have to go through this process alone. There's many folks, including former and current grad students, who are willing and able to help you along the way. And so don't hesitate to reach out for help during this process, which again can be very stressful and overwhelming. And before we go to the Q&A, I do want to highlight a few key additional resources for folks to check out. And so, of course, Científico Latino, who's bringing us together today, they offer a lot of helpful resources and information for folks, including different forms of programming, mentorship, in blog posts, etc. And so definitely encourage you to check out their website much more extensively. Also at the website myundocumentedlife.org, there's an Undocugrads blog series where you can learn more about the experiences of folks who identify as undocumented and have pursued graduate school degrees. And so that's another resource that I'd encourage you to check out. There's also the Dream.us, which provides support, resources, GRE discount codes. They also provide like a really good and strong sense of community and network for folks who are doing the Dream.us fellowship or program, I should say. And so in addition, there's the fellowship directory put together by Immigrants Rising that I mentioned. There's also the Undocugrad guide that I shared the link in the chat box here. And there's also a few reading recommendations that I included here. These are more general books on grad school, but they're still really helpful to just think through as you're crafting your own research statement, your personal statement, etc. And so let me conclude here just so that we have enough time to address any questions or concerns that folks may have about the topics I've covered thus far. Also happy to go back to any of the previous slides if you'd like to go into greater detail on them or just discuss further. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information and resources, but I'm happy to go back to any of these that folks may have questions on. So let me end here. And I'll go back to some of these slides as needed. And I'm seeing some questions here in the Q&A. And somebody is wondering if there is a list of institutions organized by DACA or undocumented student friendliness, and what would it take to create such a list if there isn't one? Thank you for that question. That's a really great question, and I feel like that would be a very helpful resource indeed. As far as I know, the higher ed immigration portal is working towards something like it. And let me see if at least for private schools, let me see if I can find it really quick. Yes, I did. And so they are an organization that's trying to develop an interactive tool that's tracking admission and financial aid policies for undocumented students who are interested in pursuing a private college or universities. And so let me share the link in the chat feature. This is only again for like private schools, so it doesn't include public schools. But it's sort of like a really helpful starting point. And so when you click on it, you're able to select like the state that you're thinking of, for example. And so let's say I selected California, then you can choose among some of the private colleges there. So if I select Pomona College, then it takes you to a bit more detailed information about what kind of support they provide for undocumented students. And so I mentioned it because it's a really helpful tool, and I think it's a work in progress. So they're going to be adding more and more schools into their database here. But that's one of the ones that I know of. And yeah, I mean, hopefully we can see more efforts like it because I agree it would be a very, very helpful resource for folks to have something like it. So thank you for that question. And then let me see, I'm seeing other questions here. And sorry, I should have checked in with you, Denisha, if it's okay if I just start taking questions.
Yeah, that's absolutely okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course. So let's see. I would like to know where to connect with tutors to be ready for applying for a program, and then Austin, Texas. Yeah, I would say some places to start. I think, and I don't know if through Científico Latino, there might already be like folks that can be like connected or not, but um, I feel like Científico Latino would be like one example of an organization to keep in touch with and reach out to and check out like their programming and resources, because those provide really helpful avenues for connecting with folks who are at different parts of the state or of the country, who can serve as potential mentors, and or even just folks who can share their personal trajectories. Um, I'm trying to think if there's other organizations, I mean, other than Científico Latino, and the New York State Youth Leadership Council, Immigrants Rising, United We Dream. Um, there's sort of all these other organizations where folks can connect for sure. But in Austin, Texas, I'm blinking out right now if there's like a specific like student-led organization, for example. Um, but I'll try to do some brainstorming around that as well. And then let me see, there's another question here about how does funding work for students applying to STEM PhD programs, labs that are usually government funded? Should I focus my efforts on applying to labs, PIs that have funding that is not government or federal? Very good question, very important consideration to keep in mind. Yes, so I say it's a really good question because for STEM, in particular, funding may be tied to a federal agency like the NIH or NSF. And so sometimes when it's tied to federal funding, there's specific guidelines and requirements around immigration status. And so for that, I would say it sort of becomes that much more imperative to check in with the particular programs, but even sort of a step beyond that, also to check in with potential PIs and learning more about one, the type of work that they're doing, their labs, etc. But then also some considerations and questions around restrictions around funding for undocumented students. There might be either alternative sources of funding that they're able to access at the institutional level, that allow them to sort of create like a position or two for like undocumented folks. But some of this, again, it's really dependent on the program, on the PI, on the school. I know some schools are trying to be more creative around creating some of those alternative options for folks. Um, and so in terms of pieces of advice, definitely I would say I would recommend checking in with potential PIs, but then also checking in with folks who've pursued the STEM route and then seeing what their experiences were like. Because maybe they know of like specific programs or schools um, that have been better at providing some of these alternative options where federal funding is a concern. Um, and so those are some like pieces of advice to keep in mind when navigating like the STEM route for sure. Um, and then what specific questions should I be asking of an institution as an undocumented student? Um, Great question. And I should say some of this too, um, is going to depend on your own like comfort levels. I want to be mindful that the decision to disclose or conceal your immigration status throughout the entire process is one that's very much dependent on your own sense of comfort, sense of risk, sense of safety, and these things are changing over time. And so I say that because sometimes it may be the case that you have a trusted mentor ask on your behalf some of these questions, or you yourself are the one asking those questions in person or on email. And so all of this can look very differently. Um, it's also something that may come up as you're writing your personal statements and you're sort of thinking through, do I mention in there that I grew up undocumented? Do I not? And so these are all very important questions and very important decisions that will sort of vary at the individual level for sure. And there's no right or wrong way to do this in. And so that's sort of like the context that I want to mention. But in terms of very specific questions to ask, definitely figuring out whether the program provides funding for undocumented students with or without DACA. And so sort of figuring out like, are there financial packages connected to a student needing to be a research assistant or a teaching assistant? And if yes, do they require a work permit in order to be a teaching or a research assistant? And if they do require it, and you're someone who identifies as undocumented without DACA or another form of temporary work permit, then part of those questions and discussions might be around alternatives. Maybe there's particular fellowships that the school has available or the program has available. I know in some of the schools, in some of the public schools in California, they're trying to think more creatively around alternative programs and fellowships for undocumented folks without DACA. The other thing I'll mention is that sometimes private schools tend to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of their funding when it comes to grad school and undocumented students. And so that's also another consideration to keep in mind as you're thinking of like, okay, what schools can I apply to? And sort of not to limit yourself between like private or public, but rather like consider both and consider both of them in the context of all these other factors, like I mentioned, location, costs, fees, funding, sources of support, etc. Um, and then let me see. Another question is, are universities open to providing visas in the case of DACA lapses? That's a really good question. So not, I mean, I don't want to say a straight yes or no question because some of this I feel like is being discussed, developed, thought through. I will mention that in California, there's efforts like the Opportunity for All bill that's being proposed and considered. And these are efforts that, or at least for the Opportunity for All, it's being led by undocumented youth who are advocating for some sort of work um, for work opportunities for folks who identify as undocumented without deferred action. And so that's like one initiative that's in the works. But again, that's legislation that's being considered and discussed. And so there's nothing final as of yet around that. But other particular campuses, again, are also sort of in discussion and really trying to think like through what the future, what the foreseeable future might look like for folks, even those who have DACA right now. But because we know that DACA is still in limbo, is still in jeopardy, like what will that look like? And so because there's no definitive answers right now, as far as I'm aware, and some of this is going to definitely vary by program and institution. I would say the best thing to do is sort of to check in with the particular programs that you're thinking through. Um, and also part of that discussion will be an honest conversation around like if DACA were to be taken away, what work opportunities or fellowship opportunities will be available? What will the school do to support undocumented students? And so yeah, I 1000% hear you. That's a very important question. It's just one of those things that would require more specific, like basically like asking the particular programs um, that you're considering. Um, and then I'm seeing a question here from somebody that's asking if I am comfortable disclosing my status, how early into the application process should I disclose it? In my personal statement interview, once I get accepted into the program? Great question. And so it can be done differently. just some scenarios and examples. I have seen folks who share their immigration status at the moment when they're reaching out to potential faculty that they would like to work with. Um, so that's one of the things that, again, is by no means a requirement that you reach out to faculty ahead of time. But some folks do that, and in doing that, they let folks know that they themselves are undocumented during their meeting. So that's one approach where it may be helpful because then during the meeting, you're sort of already asking questions around funding, around support for undocumented students and what that looks like. Other folks may wait until their actual, like when they write their personal statement in there, they mention it, but in the context of, um, let's say, you mentioned it in your research statement, or no, I'm sorry, in your personal statement, because usually that will ask you about your background and what motivates you to pursue a grad degree. And so you're sort of bringing up considerations around growing up undocumented and how that fueled your passion um, for going into grad school. And so I've seen it mentioned there as well. Also, certainly possible and likely that folks don't share their status until they're accepted into the program. And so as they're considering the financial package, then that's when they'll share their immigration status. Sometimes the online application tool will ask you for information about your status, like whether you, and that question may look different depending on the program. Sometimes it'll be like, are you a US citizen, yes or no? And then you sort of like answer that accordingly and accurately. Other times you'll even see options of like, do you identify as an undocumented student or as a AB 540 student or as a DACA recipient? And so there might be some sort of question like that in the grad school online application itself. But again, may or may not, or the way that it looks like is gonna depend by the program. Um, and then, yeah, so honestly, it can look very differently. Very differently by applicant, very differently by program. And so really think through your own sense of risk and safety, comfort levels, and what makes most sense for you individually. And also think through, or I think as you make that decision, another thing that's helpful is just to connect with folks who've gone through the process and then see how they've done it, what they thought about, the pros and cons of each one. And then as you're doing that, that's sort of like really helpful guidance for the decision that makes the most sense for you. Um, okay, I know that was a really long answer, but hopefully that's really helpful for folks. And then let me see other questions. I'm seeing some questions too in the chat feature here. Who should we be approaching to be our mentors, and how should we go about asking for mentorship through the graduate school application process? Could we reach out to professionals outside of our institution? Yeah, I would say in terms of connecting with potential mentors, I would say different ways to go about it. So sometimes it might be reaching out to like let's say you graduated from undergrad a couple of years ago. And so some of that might mean that now that you're getting ready to apply to grad school, you go back to some of the professors that you had as in undergrad. Maybe their classes really inspired you or motivated you, or you found them interesting, and you sort of go back to them to offer them like an update, a quick check-in, and then part of that you're sort of seeking their guidance and mentorship for some of the questions that may be coming up for you. For connecting with formerly and or currently undocumented folks, then I would say the best place to sort of do that is through organizations, like I mentioned, because that's really where you can sort of develop that sense of community and networking, etc. And so it's great that you're already taking the initiative to like attend events such as this one and connecting with organizations like Científico Latino to really be proactive about connecting with folks who identify as currently or formerly undocumented and seek mentorship that way. And then, and yeah, definitely. I mean, if as you're sort of also reaching out to professionals outside of the institution, I would say, yeah, like certainly think through what your dream career or your dream field is. Maybe like just for example, let's say somebody is really passionate about working for a nonprofit one day. And so then you can think through what are some nonprofits whose work you really look up to or you find interesting, um, or you see yourself one day doing similar work. And so those are the type of folks that you can also think through reaching out to. But really, the key is to, as you're going through this process, yes, it's important to acknowledge that it's going to be stressful, overwhelming, highly uncertain because of the context that we're in, particularly. But to sort of remind yourself that it's okay to reach out to others for support. There's other folks who've gone through the process and are willing and able to be there for mentorship and support, so that you don't feel like you have to be going through this alone, or you don't feel isolated during the process. And so yeah, it's great. It's a great idea to think creatively about who to reach out to both in your institution and outside of it as well. Um, and then let me see. I might have question, or I might have time for one more question. Um, and then okay, so let me tackle this one. And this is a question from somebody who has DACA, grew up in California, and did their high school and undergrad at a school in California. So you knew that you qualified for AB 540, but you're sort of, oh, and then now that you're in the East Coast, you're wondering if you would still qualify for AB 540. Um, and then if you can reach out, you're wondering if it makes sense to reach out to admissions at each school. Great question. And another resource that I would encourage you or anyone else who's thinking of applying to grad school programs in public schools in California would be to consider reaching out also to the staff who work at the different Dreamer Resource Centers. Sometimes they're called Dreamer Resource Centers, other times they're called Undocumented Student Services Office. Um, or undocumented student services program. And so, and these are offices that are currently in place in the um, public California higher ed institutions. And so let's say you're considering applying to UC Santa Cruz, UC Santa Barbara, CSU Fullerton, etc. Or yeah, um, then you would want to reach out also to the staff there, because one, the staff there are amazing, but then two, they're really knowledgeable about the different policies that apply both at the undergrad and the grad level. They can also connect you potentially with students who are doing their grad degree in that particular school. And so that would also be in addition to reaching out to admissions and financial aid at some point. You could also, or I would also encourage folks to reach out to the folks who are working at like the Dreamer Resource Center offices or undocumented student services as well. And then the GRE waiver opportunities, I think there's a couple of questions on that. And then let me see if by a quick search, I can find the particular information. I should also mention this other resource. There's this other guide, and I just shared it in the chat feature here. It's another really helpful guide for folks who are undocumented and applying to grad school. Sorry, I was like trying to read the little bit on the waivers. So it looks like the guide goes over waivers for the LSAT. Yeah, so some of this, it looks like it makes the most sense to contact like the LSAT or the GRE or the MCAT directly to see their fee waiver requirements more specifically, because these things are changing. So sometimes there may be periods where they open those for undocumented applicants. Other times they might close it out and restrict it based on immigration status. And so for the latest and most up-to-date information, highly recommend checking with their official websites. And then also reaching out if you have questions as well. But yeah, I hope those answers were helpful. Sorry I didn't get a chance to go through every question, but hopefully we covered many of them. And yeah, feel free to reach out if any other questions, if folks have any other questions after today's webinar.
Thank you so much for giving your talk and answering so many questions. This was a great webinar, and I hope this was helpful to the audience. And with that being said, thank you so much, Dr. Carolina. And to everyone else, take care. Thank you for attending. Any further questions, please feel free to email us. I can drop the email in the chat really quickly before heading out. But thank you guys again for everything.
Thank you. Thank you all. It was great connecting with you all, and thank you for having me.